Hello, BookTube, and welcome back to Epic Comic Book Wednesday. This is a world's finest collaboration between myself and Michael K Vaughan, where we combine the forces of stately Vaughan Manor and Hyde Cottage to talk about the comic books on which we've wasted our youths. And since I horned in on the whole thing eons ago, Michael is the one who gets to pick what we talk about every week. This will be the last Epic Comic Book Wednesday for 2023 that I do with him. And he picked a doozy today. Ordinarily, when I say that we talk about the comic books on which we've wasted our youths, I'm not completely accurate. Our youths do not exactly overlap. Usually, the comics on which I've wasted my youth, the characters, the concepts on which I've wasted my youth, predate the ones that Mike has spent his youth on. But not today. Not today. Today, he picked something that was, for him, a marvelous door opener of an amazing reading experience. And then he went from that reading experience to comic books, to that thing being adapted for comic books. And I experienced the exact same thing. This also was an amazing door opener of a reading experience for me in my youth, and is every bit as treasured by me as it is by him for that reason. It's just maybe the time period at which that happened that would be different, that would be slightly different. And what we're talking about here is John Carter of Mars by Edgar Rice Burroughs, the famous creator of Tarzan. Also created a character called John Carter, who was a Confederate cavalryman on Earth. In the aftermath of the war, he goes out west and deals with savage redskins, as Edgar Rice Burroughs would say, that corner him in a cave. They're afraid to enter. Something horrifying is in that cave. They refuse to enter. And he loses consciousness. And when he wakes up, he's naked, looking down at his body. But he doesn't stick around in the cave and be morose for long, because he finds himself drawn to the red dot of Mars, the planet Mars in the sky, when suddenly he experiences a moment of intense cold and leaps from Earth to Mars. He transports himself to Mars, where he appears, also stark naked, on a plane, just an empty, barren plane, and realizes, when he finally gets his wits about him, that he is on the planet Mars. This was a fascination in Edgar Rice Burroughs' day. That's one of the differences between Michael K. Vaughan experiencing John Carter of Mars and myself experiencing John Carter of Mars, since Michael K. Vaughan probably learned, I don't know the exact details, but he probably learned about John Carter of Mars at, I don't know, his used bookstore, or from a schoolmate, or maybe in, the comics racks. Maybe he learned about it from the comic that we're talking about today. Whereas I went to school with Percival Lowell, who was also fascinated with Mars. So it's slightly different time period. But it had very, very long effects. John Carter of Mars had very long effects. John Carter of Mars was, for decades, the most deeply held personal dirty secret of half of the public intellectuals anywhere in the Western world. One of whom went on to become an extreme poobah of what you should read and why, but who fell in love with reading through John Carter of Mars and went to his grave. It was his rosebud. He went to his grave denying, never allowing any inference like that to be made. And he wasn't the only one. Oh my, all the leather elbow patch, stuffed shirt, pseudo intellectuals that I've seen over the last 60 years. I could spot a mile away the ones that have this dirty secret, where I want so bad to walk up to one of them at some sort of Chicago panel where they're talking about, the informal realities of the dialectic. I want so bad to creep up to Lionel Trilling's elbow and say, Deja Thors. Just watch him freeze. I know that would happen. I could pick them a mile away. And that shadow also includes 2 teenage boys in Ohio. For reasons that become obvious the minute you start reading the first John Carter adventure. Under the Moons of Mars, or The Princess of Mars, you realize that when John Carter starts to realize that he's on Mars, he realizes something else, which is that his muscles have been bred for Earth, and Mars has a tiny fraction of Earth's gravity. So when he tries to walk, he springs into the air. And when he leaps, he can virtually fly. And he's also immensely strong. His muscles are just denser on Mars than anything that was born and bred on Mars. In other words, he comes from a planet with much greater density, much greater gravity. And when he shows up on a world with much less gravity, he has superpowers. He is faster than a speeding bullet, more powerful than a locomotive, able to leap tall buildings or 1/8 of a mile in a single bound. A couple of kids in Ohio got a real idea out of that and a couple of other things that they read. And through a weird series of events, John Carter fights his way to the very top of society, because the Mars that he finds himself on is inhabited. It's profusely inhabited. It is a dying world. It once had vibrant oceans. It once had a far thicker and more vibrant atmosphere, and all of that is going away. But it's still home to large amounts of life. There are the Warhoons and the Tharks, these four-armed, tall, green, bald, insectile aliens with huge tusks that are sentient and have the beginnings of technology. The technology on Mars, Mars's inhabitants call it Barsoom. The technology on Barsoom is odd. It's an odd mixture of super science and 19th century Sir Walter Scott heroics. Characters carry swords and knives, but they also have radium pistols. It's a well-evoked world. Burroughs obviously thought this out a little ahead of time, which was not usual for him. He thought out ahead of time a world whose current inhabitants might not be all that familiar with the world in its greatest time, in its pinnacle, when it was an Earth-like world instead of a world where oceans are drying up and where the hordes of savage Warhoons are now growing in the desert plains and threatening civilization. The inhabitants of Mars might know more of that past than they at first seem, since Burroughs had a thing. He had a thing about a lot of the fantastic worlds that he created, and that thing was immortality. And you only have to know a little about how he ended his life, and how one, and especially another of his loved ones, ended their lives, to figure out why this would be a thing for him, why immortality would be a thing for him. The inhabitants of Barsoom live a long, long time. There are the Warhoon, of course, but there are also the red people of Mars. Exactly humanoid, only with bright red, think Spider-Man's costume, bright red skin. And they are different from humans in a number of ways. Two main ways. One is that they are functionally immortal. They live for centuries and centuries and centuries. And the other is that they're oviparous. The women lay eggs. They also do a large amount, that both the red men and lots of other races on Barsoom do a lot of communication through telepathy, low-grade telepathy, which John Carter eventually starts to pick up on. He is most often in the novel Princess of Mars, he is most often mistaken for a red man because he looks just like them except for his skin tone. But through a series of adventures that are aided by the fact that he essentially has superpowers, he is able to rise to the rank of warlord of Barsoom. The first three John Carter of Mars novels, The Princess of Mars, Swords of Mars, and Gods of Mars, are effectively a trilogy. They bring John Carter's story. They have an arc. They have a narrative arc. They very much feel like Book 1, Book 2, and Book 3. The series goes on from there and features all kinds of things. There are novels that feature adventures conducted by John Carter's son. There are novels featuring his daughter. And there's a novel featuring another Earthman who goes to Mars, Ulysses X. Paxton, who goes to Mars and also has adventures. And the stories eventually, they come back to John Carter, who has lots of adventures of his own. But those first three are the best three. My favorite is Thuvia, Maid of Mars, and I also am very fond of Lana of Gothel. But the first three are the best ones and the best constructed, which is why you will sometimes see them collected in one volume. and editors sometimes don't know what to do with the other ones. We'll toss in one extra one, but you got to have those first three. I often wish that we could get those three novels in a really nice illustrated deluxe paperback with the floppy binding and the French flaps and the deckled edges and tons of illustration. And there's a part of me, it's a little bit heretical for today's subject matter, there's a part of me that wishes those illustrations were by a comic book artist named Murray Anderson, who was a heck of a guy, a sweetheart, a consummate professional, and who drew John Carter when Edgar Rice Burroughs Incorporated eventually started selling these things, selling the franchise to comic book companies. He drew a backup feature of John Carter that was... Murray Anderson is not exactly my kind of artist. He's a little bit stiff, but boy, oh boy, is he detailed and wonderful. And as far as I know, the Murray Anderson John Carter of Mars stories have never been collected anywhere. Unlike today's adaptation, because we are talking about a comic book adaptation of John Carter of Mars. We're talking about the one that was done when the franchise was sold to Marvel Comics in the 70s. Edgar Rice Burroughs approached them, and they got Tarzan, and they got John Carter of Mars. And this is issue number 1, John Carter, Warlord of Mars. This was written by Marv Wolfman and drawn by Gil Kane, who did the cover, a very standard Gil Kane cover. It's not his most effective cover. It's busy. First of all, it's too busy. Your eye doesn't know where to look. There's too much going on here. And also, Gil Kane had a gimmick that he did with covers. He loved to do it. If you look at a gallery of... I don't think there's ever been a big hardcover of the collected artwork of Gil Kane. Collected covers and posters of Gil Kane. I don't think that's ever happened. Even though I don't think it's happened with hardly any comic book artists, and that's a terrible shame because more people saw these than ever looked at the Mona Lisa. But if you were to look at a run of his covers together especially, you would see this gimmick over and over again. The gimmick is this guy. On Gil Kane covers, there's always a guy in the foreground calling. See, he's calling and pointing at the subject of the cover. There's a good reason for it. Composition-wise, there's an excellent reason to do that, but you don't want to do it 4 times a year for 50 years. You don't want to do that. There's an obvious way to fix this cover. And Gil Kane just didn't see it, that's all, or didn't feel like doing it, or wanted to put in as much fantasy as possible. This is an overload of fantasy. If you wanted to put in as much fantasy as possible, then you include the Thipdar, you include this monster here, even though it's incidental, and risks having the hero of your book a footnote on his own cover. The key to fix this cover, you can still keep all of this, all of these Warhoon in the foreground. But instead of the monster and instead of the spaceships, the pro forma spaceships, have ruined stairs with John Carter crouching at the top of them. No Dejah Thoris, just John Carter with his sword facing this horde of green men. That would work. That would work a lot better than this does. But in this issue, Gil Kane is inked by Dave Cockrum. Look at that. The coloring job there by Glynis Wein. That is just amazing. This is the reason that I add such emphasis to that is because Dave Cockrum was a great artist on his own right. As a lot of you will know, some of you were reading the all-new, all-different Uncanny X-Men when he and Chris Claremont launched the whole thing. And he was the artist for the first few issues of the new X-Men with Wolverine and Colossus and Storm and Nightcrawler. Here, he's just inking Gil Kane, who was a titan in the industry. Cockrum at this point was not. And there's a little bit of an oddity there. I've never quite known the story. Marv Wolfman does... He does an editorial in the middle of this issue, shares some original sketches. This is pure Cockrum artwork. This is not Cockrum inking Gil Kane. This is preliminary sketches that Cockrum did for a run of John Carter of Mars that never actually happened. In this editorial, Wolfman says that 3 pages were done, and maybe some character sketches and maybe a cover, and then it was abandoned. And I've always wondered what that meant about this issue. Once Marvel got the franchise back to Edgar Rice Burroughs characters, once John Carter came to Marvel, well, Cockrum was obviously available because he was available to ink this issue. Was it just a question of, we want as big a name, as big a fan favorite artist as we can get, and there's none bigger than Gil Kane, so we'll do that, and all we can offer you is that you will link him? I don't really know. I don't know the politics behind it. I'm not sure that anyone ever will know, but the story starts off with John Carter furious because his wife, Deja Thoris, has been abducted and by a band of Tharks, and he doesn't know what's going on, but he is determined to, he flies out in a flyer of his own, determined to save her. And there you can see he can leap huge distances. And he's strong enough so that when he does encounter a gigantic platoon of red men, he's able to deal with them on his own. Look at that fantastic Gil Kane artwork. At which point he remembers his origin story. He remembers the story that I told you about him waking up naked next to his body and flying to Mars. But he also remembers something else. There's something about John Carter that is worth remembering when you're encountering his stories, which is that the fact that he's an Earthman on Mars with heightened speed and strength and whatnot, that looks on the surface like, okay, well, that is going to be the thing that distinguishes him until we get to know his personality. John Carter is a valiant warrior. And that distinguishes him. He never gives up. I still live. But before that, the thing that's going to separate him is that when he's on Mars, he's effectively superhuman. But that's not actually all there is to it. John Carter is weird anyway, on Earth as well as on Mars, because he doesn't remember ever being young. He remembers being this same age forever, for centuries, maybe millennia. Gil Kane actually gives us a wonderful portrait here. Yeah, see, Gil Kane, he shows us, we get blocks. Wolfman just gives you blocks from the novel. He doesn't bother writing any of this himself. But you get medieval warriors there in the background as John Carter remembers that he has never been young. I have always been such for more years than I can remember. I do not know how old I am or how long I have walked this planet Earth or the reason for what seems to be my immortality. All I know is I've always been this age, and I've always been a warrior. And he eventually finds Deja Thoris, who is being held captive in this deserted city, along with Taras Tarkas, a Thark who is also John Carter's best friend. He finds them, and he rescues them. This just more fantastic Gil Kane artwork with this beautiful detail work by Cockrum, just beautiful. Cockrum is so good at, no offense to him, but he's so good at inanimate objects. Carter saves them. The whole point of this first issue is that this is the hero. He does not have any angst. He does not have any setbacks. He's easily able to defeat his enemies and save the princess. But that doesn't answer the question. The Thark that kidnapped her was in the pay of someone else. And that doesn't answer the question of why any of this is happening. So we end on a cliffhanger. Yeah, there we go. We end on a cliffhanger. They are reunited. You don't see the death blow because this is a G-rated comic, but we end on a cliffhanger, and so you're shot right away into issue number 2. I remember when these came out. In my metal spinner rack, there was Tarzan #1 and John Carter #1, and I was fascinated by both of them. A huge Edgar Rice Burroughs fan, so I was eager to read both of them. They're very different in their way. First issue of Tarzan is a masterpiece. The first issue of John Carter is a masterpiece, although I had my issues with this. I wonder if Mike will have issues too, because we don't have a greater Edgar Rice Burroughs fan on BookTube than Michael K. Vaughan. In his editorial in the middle of this issue, Marv Wolfman says that he is not going to adapt any of the Edgar Rice Burroughs novels. He's going to tell instead a raft of stories that he is locating in an almost 10-year gap in The Princess of Mars. At the end of the Princess of Mars, John Carter mentions that, this adventure ended, and then I had many other adventures for 9 years, and then we pick up the story after that. Marv Wolfman, in his editorial, says, well, that seemed like the perfect opportunity. That I'll just tell stories from there so that I'm not beholden to the novels. Which raises a couple of big problems for this. When I read that editorial, it was the first thing on my mind. I said it to a bed full of sleeping beagles who couldn't have cared less. I said 2 things. One, well, you you can't call it John Carter, Warlord of Mars, if that's when you're setting the stories, because he's not Warlord of Mars yet at that point. And also, too, does that mean you're going to leave out all the stuff that's in the later novels? How many times is Isis, the goddess of death, mentioned in this issue alone? And so on and so forth. Are you going to leave those out? A lot of those marvelous, incredible creatures and beings and forces and whatnot, John Carter explicitly encounters for the first time, or some character does, in later novels. If they haven't happened yet, I had my doubts, but I thought, if that is a license for you to be creative, then go right ahead. Go right ahead and do that. I'm on for the long haul. I think to those Sleeping Beagles, I actually said, I'm here for the long haul. But the long haul was torturous. When it comes to lack of consistency in comic book adaptations, oh my. As bad as the drop-off was from issue number 1 to issue number 2 with Tarzan of the Apes, it was much worse with John Carter of Mars. Or Warlord of Mars. It was much worse. Through no fault of trying on the part of the company, it's odd. And again, I wish I knew the story behind it. But one by one, the people that know these stories are dying, and they're not committing them to paper. So we're never going to know the story. Ordinarily, when you have a commission for a new comic book series, something especially that's going to start with the first issue, say nothing of Claremont's X-Men, that was going to pick up with its old numbering and presumably have a fan base already locked in. If you're starting a new project, even if it's a character that's a franchise character, so again, you're assuming you have an audience locked in, you're going to pitch that idea to an editor. You're going to pitch your approach to it. The editor's going to take a number of different pitches for a number of different approaches. Then when you get the green light, you're either going to pick an artist or you're going to get an artist assigned to you, and that artist is going to have lots of conference sessions with you about what you want the thing to look like and what they want it to look like. And then you will gradually work up a batch of issues so that your editor and your publisher know what they can market. That's usually the way this happens. And all that happens a long time before there's even a slight hint of it in Stan's soapbox or anywhere else. All of that is happening behind the scenes months and months and months and months ahead of time. And I don't get the impression that happened with John Carter, Warlord of Mars. I don't get that impression at all. First of all, the art team is not consistent for even 2 issues. Dave Cockrum does not ink issue number 2. Rudy Nebres does, who's a fantastic inker, although he's not right for Gil Kane. He's a fantastic inker. He's a fantastic artist on his own right, and he does a lot of work on John Carter, Warlord of Mars. He's well worth it as an inker. I'm not slighting him at all. But some narrative magic, the narrative magic that was in this issue, is almost entirely missing in issue number 2, and it only flickers after that. You get, if I remember correctly, you get a run of really good Gil Kane covers. But Gil Kane stops being the artist fairly quickly. And it's musical chairs for inkers even before he goes. And when he's gone, some of the artists that replace him are not very good, or are going to be great, but are not great yet, and are not doing good work. It becomes a very, very uneven feeling. There was the first John Carter, Warlord of Mars annual, I think had Sal Buscema artwork and was very good. It was a very good annual, but most of the issues, they're overwritten, they're over-talky, and the Marvel run on John Carter shares a quality with the Edgar Rice Burroughs run on John Carter, which is that the writer, when the writer's distracted by shiny lights or multi-armed apes or whatnot, the writer will forget that John Carter can break these people's heads like chicken eggs. the writer will forget that he has superpowers, except maybe for jumping here and there. But you don't. If you're from a denser gravity, it doesn't just manifest in your legs. It would mean that John Carter could punch through rock, and we'd never see him do that. It would mean that no monster could possibly stand against him, even unarmed. We never see that. That never happens. And it should. Nevertheless, I'm a huge Edgar Rice Burroughs fan, and I'm a huge John Carter fan. I like John Carter more than I like Tarzan, which has often struck friends of mine who know my own personal history as pretty ironic. I like John Carter more than anything this author wrote. And so I stuck with the comic for a while, I think a year. I think it lasted for 2 years. I think I stuck around for 1 year. And then I would just see it on the newsstand but think, it's a Gil Kane cover, but it's not Gil Kane artwork. Don't be lured. Don't do that. So there were a lot of John Carter stories that I hadn't read or weren't familiar with at all. So when Marvel brought out a hardcover omnibus of John Carter, I was interested, but it was eye-wateringly expensive. The only person who's going to buy those hardcover omnibus editions at cover price is Michael K. Vaughan, who I'm pretty sure had not been born yet, or was still in grade school when that big hardcover came out. So I passed on it, and then years and years and years later, New England Comics, or Newbury Comics, here in Boston, they used to have a really good comics remainder section. They actually still do. Like normal books, comics also get remaindered. And one time I went in there on a very hot summer day, and they had that omnibus of John Carter for, I think, a third of the cover price. I don't remember exactly what it was, but it was money that I had in my pocket. So I bought it and encountered the same problem I've encountered with those omnibus editions every time I do it. I don't know why. I do it. Because they're not usable. They're storable on your shelf to have a nice big collection of them, but you can't use them to actually read. They're too big and heavy to take anywhere. You can't put them in a bag. You can't leave the dust jacket on them because it'll slip right off because these things weigh 5 pounds. And the binding isn't strong enough on even the best of them to take repeated reading, which is what I would like to do with comic books. I tend to read them. So I had that omnibus forever and ever. A whole bunch of others too, a couple of Thor omnibuses, a couple of Captain America omnibuses, a whole bunch of things. And I eventually got rid of it. It eventually just ended up in a book sale to the Brattle or given away to somebody. I don't remember exactly how I got rid of that volume, but I got rid of it. I missed it, but I got rid of it. I read through it, so I had the gist of what happens in the later issues of John Carter that I didn't read. But I thought no more about it, and I certainly wasn't going to buy back issues, single issues of these comics. No way. I have issue number 1 because I loved it. It brought a huge smile to my face when I saw it. But I wasn't about to buy back issues at Million Year Picnic or wherever of all the earlier ones. And I was pretty sure, thanks to the weirdness of franchises, that there would never be a Marvel Masterworks volume or now an Epic collection, a Marvel Epic collection, that would never happen. And so far it hasn't. So I was just recently at Million Year Picnic, a comic shop, a dedicated comic shop. No Funko Pops, no board games, no nothing. Just comics. One of the only ones left in the country. Great place. I went with Michael K. Vaughan when he visited, and then I went back months later, and I found this. At the time that this 1-volume paperback was made, Dark Horse Comics owned the rights. They had the franchise to John Carter, and were doing stuff of their own, mostly involving how Dejah Thoris, the incomparable Dejah Thoris, the princess of helium that he encounters when he goes to Mars, is a no-nonsense girl boss who don't need no man and is the girl who's the key to everything. The current Barsoom comics that are being published are wretchedly awful. It's not just even a question of do you like the artwork, the primitive questions that my generation used to ask. They're wretched desecrations of the franchise. But Dark Horse had the franchise, which allowed them to reprint the Marvel issues. And so they did. This does not have the Glynis Wein coloring or anybody else's coloring, but this has every issue. There's some Rudy Nebris inking for you. That's, I think, Rudy Nebris artwork. Is that right? Oh my, look at how lovely that is. Oh no, oh my, okay, no. This issue is called The History Holocaust, and you get Rudy Nebris inking, definitely. But the artwork, the actual pencil sketching, is done by a guy named Walt Simonson. Fancy that. And he's not the only one. Frank Miller is in here. Jim Starlin is in here. But not in their recognizable form at all. But this thing is easy to use. It's just a floppy paperback. I was overjoyed to see it. I did not know this existed. I must have missed it. So now I have those issues. It's true that I don't have them in color. But that's okay. I can live with that. Oh, look at this. They put Jim Starlin on the back. That's Jim Starlin drawing John Carter just to think, hey, kids, comics. So I have this. I now can revisit all of those earlier issues. But liberties were taken. It was a good enough run for Marvel. This certainly, part of the resentment that I felt towards it was that the resentment that I felt towards the physical factor of that hardcover. with that's gone, I'm able to see these with a bigger smile. I do wish that the Murray Anderson John Carter were existed in a paperback. That would be great. God knows the kind of rights issues that you would have to try and get that. But like, for instance, the same thing would be said of the DC franchise for Tarzan at the time, which was being done by Joe Kubert. It just is amazing. The greatest visual representation of Tarzan that's ever been done, and one of the greatest comic book runs that's ever been done. Is there an ordinary fat paperback of that with maybe redone colors? Not that I know of. Once upon a time, there were a bunch of hardcovers from Dark Horse or somebody, whoever it was that had the franchise at the time, but those are now intensely collectible, and I don't think anything the equivalent. I don't think any of that's ever been reprinted. And the Murray Anderson John Carter feature was the backup for that in a lot of those Weird World issues, and I don't think they've ever been collected. And that would be great. It'd be a different version of John Carter. It'd be great if we could get another version of John Carter. That would be terrific. Something that captures the weird, exotic nature of Edgar Rice Burroughs' Barsoom, that nature that snared so many readers because it's so incredible. It's such a high, wonderful combination of, well, Errol Flynn swashbuckling movies, Dune, and Viraconian. It's such a wonderful combination. The whole idea of an exotic, chivalric, dying world full of monsters and heroes. Oh, just wonderful. The books retain every bit of their power to enchant. I worry that they're not getting a chance to exercise that power, because where are the cheap mass market paperbacks with wonderful covers in bookstores today? They don't exist. Barnes & Noble makes, at one point anyway, they made a big leather-bound edition of some John Carter novels with a boring John Carter of Mars cover and a sword and whatnot. No idea that it's science fiction or fantasy. No idea of anything, any of the visual concepts that are in it. I doubt very much that a 13-year-old Steve or a 13-year-old Mike would buy that thing. First of all, he wouldn't have the money unless he's a gamer online. And second, where would be the exoticism? Where would anything pull in that kind of reader? So I don't know. I've said many times before, I really don't understand the Edgar Rice Burroughs literary estate. I really don't understand them. I don't understand why they have almost never made a good decision in their entire time incorporated. This was pretty much the last good decision that they made. I'll never understand otherwise. But that is our comic for today. That is actually how we will wrap up the Epic Comic Book One Day as a collaboration. Mike might do one next week. But as a collaboration, that's how we'll wrap up this year with a terrific science fiction character. John Carter of Mars is a terrific science fiction character. If you have not read A Princess of Mars, you might want to give it a try. And it was fun to go down memory lane with this issue. It was a wonderful pick. Well, unbeknownst to Mike, I'm not sure that we ever covered it when we talked here at Hyde Cottage, since we were too busy, both of us, cooing and awing over Frida. I don't think we ever talked about this is an enormous thing that we share in common. I can virtually see all the lights going off in little Mike Vaughan's mind when he encountered Barsoom. And weird as it is, despite the fact that it's separated by 50 years, the same lights went off in my mind when I first encountered it. Exactly the same ones. That's wonderful. That's an absolutely wonderful thing. I'd love to hear from all of you. If you have fallen under the spell of the twin moons of Barsoom, I would love to hear it. And when it happened and how. But anyway, I've gone on too long about John Carter of Mars, so I'm going to wrap this up. But I'll be back. Thank you, BookTube.